Ready? Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'd like to call the meeting of the zoning subcommittee to order. Meeting was called for 5:30 on Tuesday, December 12th. And the purpose of the meeting is to review of planning board recommendations regarding the amending zoning ordinance. Would the clerk please call the roll?
Chairman Milanazzo.
Here.
Counsel Belanger.
Here.
Counsel Rourke.
Here.
3 present.
Thank you. As I mentioned, the purpose of tonight's session is to really go over the planning board recommendations. We did have a public hearing on December 5th at 7 o'clock dealing with the overall zoning amendment package or proposal. And at that time, the city council voted to recess the public hearing until we could meet as a zoning subcommittee to review the recommendations of the planning board. I'm pleased to see all the representatives tonight from the various neighborhood groups in the city. Thank you all for being here. And we will certainly have a public portion to this zoning subcommittee. But if it's okay with my colleagues, I guess I would turn it over to Eric Slagle, Director of Development Services, and Christine O'Connor, City Solicitor, to talk about the 3 issues that were referred to us by the planning board. Thank you.
Thank you. As Councilor Milanazzo mentioned, there were 3 issues that the planning board included in their recommendation to the council with regards to the zoning amendments. I'm going to address them not in the same order in which they address them on here, because I believe there's a couple that will be more controversial. So I'll try to take them in the order I think of least controversial to most. Their recommendation number 2, where they had some concerns about the section in the zoning ordinance that relates. It was number 15 on the actual zoning list that relates specifically to the entitled location and layout of parking facilities. The city had proposed an amendment to remove the portion of that part of the ordinance that says measured along a traveled way from the dormitory to be served, for a couple of reasons. Number 1 is for enforceability. From the city staff perspective, it is much simpler and easier to do with the city's GIS system to measure as a crow flies distance from a dorm to a parking facility. And there's less need for on-the-ground measurements and concerns about whether you take a diagonal across an intersection or do you have to cross it at the crosswalks. Do you walk on the right side of the street or the left side of the street if you're talking about being measured along a traveled way. So for enforceability, measured as the crow flies is much easier for the staff to handle. But I think there are a couple of caveats that need to be made clear to both the subcommittee and eventually to the council regarding this proposal. The first is, it says right in number 15, in the case of a dormitory of a nonprofit educational institution. So this is not a private dorm. This section will never apply to a private dorm. It only applies to dormitories for nonprofit educational institutions. So it would only apply in the city of Lowell to dormitories for UMass Lowell, or in the event that a private school that was a nonprofit school created a dormitory, it could in theory be applied to them as well. But we do not see this as being applied particularly often because it's only to UMass Lowell dormitories, and they don't seem to have any current plans to construct any new dorms. Certainly not any new dorms that would be more than 1,500 feet away from their own existing parking facilities. So this is just to clean up the zoning and make it more enforceable. At the city council meeting, there were concerns expressed that this would have something to do with the proposed project of the old Jean d'Arc site on Merrimack Street. It would in no way affect that site at all for multiple reasons. Number 1, it isn't a dormitory of a nonprofit educational institution. Number 2, either way you measure, even if it did impact it, either way you measure it, the closest city parking facility is more than 1,500 feet away, whether it's along a traveled way or as the crow flies. So this section will never and could never affect that private dormitory proposal. So I wanted to make that clear. So we will be going back to, we request that the subcommittee refer this section back to the full council with no changes. The second one I'd like to discuss is number 3 on the planning board's recommendations, which is number 20 in the zoning packet that came before the council. And that has to do with amending the section entitled special permits for large-scale residential projects. And I think the council will remember this has to do with making sure that we continue to get payments in lieu of taxes if a large-scale residential project is for some reason transferred to a non-tax paying entity. The planning board had concerns about this section, specifically the portion which talks about payment of real estate taxes as it refers to UMass Lowell. In consultation with the law department, we took a look at the language and are proposing a minor change to add some clarifying language in front of the words real estate taxes to kind of clarify the intent of what we're doing, which is an annual payment in the amount of what would otherwise be equivalent to the real estate taxes. And again, the city solicitor and I met and discussed this, and we met with the city manager, and we believe that this solves the concerns that the planning board has and still encapsulates, I believe, what the council and the administration were looking for in trying to maintain the tax-paying status, or the not losing the tax revenue from these large-scale residential projects. So if you see the memorandum which I submitted to you, which I'll be leaving for the full council, it shows the highlighted portion of adding that small section into number 20 to amend that.
If I could just interrupt, did we provide copies to the representatives?
I did provide copies to the representatives. Some may have come in late and not had any, so I have some extra copies right here if anybody needs some extra copies. There's some.
Thank you. I don't know if Senegal got their copy. Anne Marie, yeah, thank you. Sorry, Eric, thank you.
I was gonna just leave them on the dais.
Thank you, Mr. Manager.
So we would be requesting that the subcommittee recommend the change that's highlighted under number 20. The third section that had come up in front of the planning board, and I believe members of the Pawtuckaville Citizens Council had expressed some concerns about to the council, was listed under number 1 under the planning board's recommendations, and it encompasses both number 3 and number 4 in the full packet of zoning amendments, and has to do with inserting a new definition for a business known as a micro business. The planning board has concerns about the size of those micro businesses. The proposed ordinance had 2,000 square feet in gross area. They suggested that it would be 1,000 square feet or less in gross floor area. And the neighborhood group had expressed some concern about a project that had been proposed on the corner of East Meadow Road and Mammoth, and whether or not this would have allowed that project to go forward without the oversight of a special permit, which it had been required to get. So I do want to clarify kind of the second point first, which is it was never the intent of this proposed change to allow kind of spec construction of micro units. And so we proposed a change that said this use should only be allowed in structures existing prior to January 1st, 2017. In addition, we proposed to change the allowance in TMU from allowed as a matter of right to allowed only by special permit. However, I do think it's very important. This particular definition came out of lots of discussions with our economic development team in Department of Planning and Development about kind of twofold problems that the city was experiencing. Number one, retaining small businesses, startup businesses, makerspace businesses, and finding locations for them in the city. And number two, the filling of what, quite frankly, is a repeated problem of vacant storefronts in the downtown and in some of our urban districts. As the council is well aware, these are issues that we struggle with. We want to do everything we can to maintain these small businesses in the city, because it's the growth of those businesses in the city that leads to, job creation and a higher corporate tax base. And the economic development team had received consistent inquiries from businesses that were doing kind of maker businesses or microbreweries, so kind of very small businesses that didn't have the appropriate space where they could exist. So we made a couple of proposed changes in zoning to try to address that. One was the creation of a craft business that allowed for you to have something in our downtown as long as you had a retail component to try to maintain kind of the vibrant streetscape that we all want. The other piece is this micro business, and so the idea is that there are very small spaces located in a lot of our downtown and urban districts that we're struggling to fill. The landlords are struggling to fill them because of the size of the space and because of some of the parking requirements in some of the districts. So even when sometimes we find a business that might be able to fit into a space, if there's not parking available on site, they struggle to meet the zoning requirements. And so we've addressed it in a lot of places in here, trying to retain and encourage these small businesses. But the micro business is one of the key features. And the idea would be, in a space that's less than 2,000 square feet, you could have a craft business and not need to meet the parking requirements. And the idea would be, because that sort of craft business is not 2,000 square feet of full retail, but it's 2,000 square feet or less of space that devoted some things to retail, but would ideally house these startup businesses, the smaller businesses that we want to encourage and grow. We spoke to the team in economic development. They did an analysis of a photograph in time of the properties that are available now. And there's quite a bit of properties that fall into
Less than 2,000.
less than 2,000. However, very few of them fall less than 1,000. So you've got 14 or 15 properties around the DMU, UMU districts that are 2,000 square feet or less, but only 2 of them are 1,000 square feet or less. So I don't want to artificially cut off the application of this section by reducing it so small that there aren't any properties that it actually applies to. We want to, and I think the council wants to, encourage these small businesses to come and stay in the city. And we think that encouraging these kind of micro businesses to exist will encourage them to stay. And keep in mind, when they want to expand, they no longer are a micro business. So that if they get too large, they need to move into another space, they then have to meet the parking requirements. The parking requirements no parking requirements apply only when they're less than 2,000 square feet. If they expand, they have to have parking. And we'll meet the challenge of where to put them when they expand, when that good thing happens, and we have to find space for these businesses. That's something that our economic development team, has experience in doing.
Right.
But we don't want to artificially force them out of the city because we can't find spaces for them to go. And we don't want to create and leave these vacancies in some of our urban districts when there are businesses that could go in there that just don't meet the specific zoning requirements at this time. One final thing I just wanted to mention, in the downtown, for business purposes, there already is no parking requirement. You don't have any parking requirements in the downtown mixed use. Only residential uses in the downtown require parking because of the parking garages and the on-street parking. So it's really the kind of the neighborhood business and urban mixed use districts that where this reduction in parking would apply.
And then under the proposed use, you're changing it from a yes to a special permit.
In the TMU, in the TMU,
TMU
yes.
zone, okay, thank you. At this point, first of all, let me recognize Councilor Mercier is here this evening, thank you, and Councilor Elliott as well. Any comments from members of the zoning subcommittee before I recognize our colleagues?
Yep. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a couple questions. Mr. Chairman, through you to Mr. Slagle. Now, Eric, currently, how are we from a proposed private project to the nearest public parking facility? How are you measuring that now?
That's, for a public parking facility, that's 1,500 square feet as the crow flies.
Okay, and what?
Square feet? Square feet?
Square feet,
1,500 linear feet, sorry. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
That would be very difficult math.
Yes, it would. Now, and you're looking to go to measure it by satellite, a different method, or what are you looking to achieve?
No. Again, that's for a private facility. That's not changing at all. This only applies to a section that specifically talks about dormitories for nonprofit educational institutions and how it's measured 1,500 feet along a traveled way. I have to be honest with you. The only time that this has been applied since it's been passed was to the Riverview Suites, on Marginal Street, the dorms that were purpose-built and already had an existing agreement with UMass Lowell at the time they were built, so they were considered dormitories for a nonprofit educational use at the time. The nearest parking facility, regardless of how you measured it, was well within 1,500 feet. I mean, they had the parking garage and parking lot across the railroad track, so it didn't restrict their construction at all.
Okay, I understand it, but how are you looking to measure it from this point on, the distance from door to door, to the garage to the...
Well, again, so that was existing, it says along a traveled way, which means you have to figure out which way to travel. And we're looking to measure it as the crow flies, which is consistent with the way we measure distances in every other section of the zoning ordinance.
Okay. And lastly, now regarding the micro businesses, now, 2,000 square feet can seem too large at first. So you had made a comment where there's only a few that you know of that are 1,000 square feet of less. So have you done any research as to the average vacant storefront, the square footage in the city, around the city, Eric, to come up with this determination?
Well, again, we did go through economic development, and they reviewed, again, a snapshot in time of the current existing vacant spaces that are up for lease, commercial spaces that are up for lease. While we didn't work up an average, I can tell you that only 2 of the spaces in the city, the current vacant commercial spaces in the city that are up for lease, are less than 1,000 square feet. There are between 14 and 15, depending on how you measure it, of those same spaces that are between 1,000 and 2,000,
Okay.
or between 0 and 2,000. So as far as providing opportunities for a micro business to exist, my concern would be cutting it down to 1,000 square feet would basically be eliminating the vast majority of
You have no value.
Yeah, you're cutting off the avenue to actually have an equity value.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman. That's all I have right now.
Thank you, Councilor. If I could just follow up on Councilor Belanger's point. So based upon your answer, looking at the first item from the planning board, further consideration be given to amend Article 2 definition, and they go through the paragraph and they suggest should be 1,000 square feet or less. So you feel that based upon working with economic development, that you've actually given it the further consideration, and based upon your analysis, you're at the 2,000 square feet.
That is correct.
Okay, thank you. Councilor Mercia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Through you to Eric Slagle. I'm concerned about the neighborhoods, not one specific, but all of them. And when I see what went on Middlesex Street, and I see that the dormitory residents have friends over and they shoot off their parking spots into side streets like Livingston Avenue and all the adjoining side streets off of Middlesex Street. I don't think that's fair. I don't think that's neighborhood friendly, especially to see that when they get out of their vehicle, they're emptying their trash onto the sidewalk. And we heard these things. I'm not making anything up. We heard them. So what this zoning change, and it confuses me a bit, because are we to believe that they can park up to 1,500 linear feet of the building, and if it happens to be that there's a garage there?
No, so this...
What does that mean?
Yeah, so this section only deals with, under zoning, you're required to have a certain number of parking spaces for a use, including a dorm. You
And
have
what,
to,
and what is that use? What is that requirement? Because someone that has 466 beds and only has 90 parking spots, that to me doesn't add up to be something right here.
right, so you're talking about the private dorm, and again, this doesn't have anything to do with the private dorm. This is only for.
I know, but
for-
since you're here, I'm asking
Sure.
these questions.
Sure, no, the private dorm requirement under our private dorm ordinance is one space per every 2 beds.
One space for every 2 beds, so.
And so, going back to the issues.
But still under parking regulations, because if there's 466 beds and it's one space per every 2 beds, and you got 93 parking spots, if you double that, that's 186, so they're still not within that. So what are they gonna do? Are they gonna park within the neighborhood? Are they gonna take up all that space for people that probably don't even have a driveway in that neighborhood? I'm concerned because if you're gonna allow that to go in, then you're gonna allow it all over. So we're talking about zoning changes and amending things. Why are we not looking at that issue? Because that, to me, is a very important issue when it comes to the tranquility of neighborhoods and trying to keep, trying to find a place to park in front of your own house other than letting a high-rise 7-story dorm come in and there's not enough parking requirement there, so they're all over the place. I don't think that's fair to the city, and I think all the zoning changes and you're addressing, that one isn't being addressed, and I don't understand that.
Well, from our perspective, right now, the project I believe you're speaking of is the proposed private dorm at the Jeanne d'Arc site. And that one hasn't been approved, but it hasn't gone through.
It has been denied twice, but it's going to be on the agenda in January. Are they going to come back till they finally get their way? Because I'm watching it very carefully, and I don't like what I see, because if it's going to happen there, it's going to happen in Pawtucketville, it's going to happen everywhere. Belvedere doesn't want a school, and I'm sure they don't want people all over the acre parking in spots that they pay taxes there for, and they probably don't have driveways in that immediate neighborhood. At least I don't know of any. So I'm concerned about them. Yes, I am.
Sure, and so that's why we have the process before the planning board and the zoning board to allow for public input to.
Well, I'm inputting now because I don't think it's right. So I will probably, well, I don't know if I could speak there, but I mean, I don't think I'd like it in my neighborhood like that when I come home, but at least I have a driveway. The people in the acre don't have a driveway, and they have to park in front of their block. And if it's loaded and utilized by dorm kids, that's not fair to them paying their rent or taxes or whatever they pay. I think it's unfair to the acre neighborhood.
Right.
That's my opinion. I'm not saying I speak for anybody else. I speak for myself.
Sure, and so just to make it clear, that project, the reason why it was denied in front of or why it was withdrawn in front of the planning board originally was because the planning board was unsatisfied with their answers about parking.
Well, just so you'll be prepared, they're coming in again in January, so I just wanted you to be aware of it.
Sure, thank you.
Thank you, Councilor Mercia. Councilor Elliott?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Can I just ask, where did the 1,500 feet figure come from?
So the 1,500 feet is a pre-existing number that's been in the zoning since it was passed back in 2004. I mean, you're talking about 1,500 feet is a quarter of a mile in an urban neighborhood. I mean, I think it's less than a quarter of a mile actually in an urban neighborhood, or no, slightly more than a quarter of a mile. But in an urban setting, I believe that you had to there has to be a judgment about how far it is reasonable to walk.
Well, is it not reasonable to have 0 feet, considering the density in our neighborhoods, the problems we anticipate certainly now with parking in most, if I would say, if not all densely populated neighborhoods? It just doesn't make any sense to me to have this allowance. It's only what limited space there is in the neighborhood. Should a development come in and consume that available space for, again, that's any large development in that area. So It just seems to me that this just might not make any sense at all whatsoever to even include this amendment to allow up to 1,500 square feet.
Well, again, and I want to make it clear, that's already what zoning says. It already says 1,500 square feet.
I understand that, Mr. Slagle, and that's why I'm asking where that number came from and why is anybody supporting a 1,500-foot, whether it's this or other, we know that there's growth, we know that the university will continue to grow, and I'm just not sure this exemption should be permitted, quite frankly. Knowing the challenges we have everywhere with parking, and then on top of that, when it snows and snow removal, and that just exacerbates and completely compounds the parking situation, and it's a real challenge. So,
Right.
I'm not so sure I'm going to support this, quite frankly, only because because it's in there, I don't necessarily agree that it's the right it's the right allowance to include in this set of amendments.
Again, in keeping that train of thought moving forward, then we would have to, and I'm not suggesting that the zoning subcommittee would recommend this, but we would have to look at that part of the zoning in order to make that change. Because all we're doing here is cleaning up the language, if you will, as the crow flies, because it's in there now.
Right.
It's in there now. Okay.
That's correct.
Okay.
So it's in there now, and this just, as Councilman Milanazo mentioned, it cleans it up, but it just eliminates language, certainly the language of measured along the travelway, and again, not more than. So it's just taking out that language, but it just defines that 1,500 foot allowance, correct?
Right, it makes it easier to enforce from our perspective. Again, because this applies only to dormitories for nonprofit educational institutions. If it's the will of the subcommittee and the council doesn't want to change it, it's not something that we regularly apply. As I said, I believe it's only been applied once since it's been passed to that specific dorm.
Mr. Chair, can I just ask one other question? So in any other zoning zones, are there allowances for this? If you're going to put a business in and it doesn't meet the parking requirements, is there a provision to allow that exception, if you will, in other particular zones?
There is, and it depends on whether the parking facility that you're looking at is owned by the city or a private parking facility. For private parking, it's 400 feet, and for facilities owned by the city, it's 1,500 feet.
Could you give some examples just for me and the people watching at home what some of those examples are? Because maybe that's a contributing factor to the complications that now exist pretty much throughout the city.
Well, sure. So, for instance, residential developments in the downtown, the proposed, Dave Daly's proposed structure at 1 East Merrimack Street, the Vision private dorm, no, the Edge, the Vision, yes, private dorm that went in on the old Lowell 5 site, the redevelopment of the Old Sun building, all of those developments required parking because they were residential developments.
And where did they find the parking that they didn't have on site?
So what typically happens in situations like that, and I believe it happened in all those cases, is they contacted the city's parking department to try and determine whether or not there was available overnight garage space parking. And typically speaking, up to fairly recently, the city's garage parking problem was different during the day than it was at night. During the day, there was typically, the garages were full, but overnight, the garages typically had available spaces. And so, and Nick Navin could speak about this way better than I could, but there's a calculation they use based on residential parking, because typically that is overnight parking and not parking during the day. So there's available overnight spaces. They allowed those spaces to be used, and those residential uses were required to have leases with the city for overnight use of the parking spaces in garages, and the parking department maneuvers those leases around to whatever garages have the space. So whether it's Lower Locks or the AOD or some of the other garages, the Mark Street garage or the one on Middlesex Street, the GM garage, that's where the parking was allowed. The developments that have happened over in the Hamilton Canal District, they all had overnight parking allowances in the Hamilton, then the new garage, the early garage, it's no longer the new garage. I guess the new garage is going to be the new Hamilton garage. But then the early garage, they had parking allowances in that garage.
Okay.
And that's what, so we do that because in urban spaces, it's very hard to have parking on site for sufficient cars to support a residential use. And so in the kind of economic environment that we've been in for the last decade or so, it hasn't been cost effective to build a parking structure
Right.
along with a residential use because it's basically unleasable space in that parking structure. You're taking away from the economic viability of a project. So the city allows those residents to park in our garages, and the developers are allowed to develop the entirety of a lot, and that makes the project economic.
Right, but in many instances, the city or the Parking Now Enterprise Fund inherits that debt, and there's not a complete one-to-one ratio where, that development is supporting clearly the construction or the operation and maintenance of those facilities. So it's a slippery slope that we're going to build a garage, with public funds, and then we'll get some, we'll get rent, we'll lease the spaces, but it's not self-sustaining, in my opinion, and I think we're facing that now. We're facing a rate increase in order to build another garage, and, so I'm not convinced that this is the best amendment.
If I could bring up one other thing, so the Thorndike project also needed parking. There isn't a municipal garage within the 1,500 feet, so they weren't allowed to use that provision. They had to use the provision that allowed another parking structure within 400 feet. So they got their parking from the LRTA
Right.
garage adjacent to the structure, but again, because it's less than 400 feet, they were within that requirement, and they were allowed to use that space. If that hadn't been there, they would have had to try to find another parking solution within that 400 feet. So we restricted a lot more when it's not a garage that we control.
Okay. All right, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Before I open it up to the public, I just want, on a point of clarification on both Councilor Elliott and Councilor Mercy's comments, which are well-founded. This language, to use your comment or to your phrase, is going to give the city more control over the parking when it relates to nonprofit educational facilities. Again, if we want to deal with the issues that both of these councils have brought up, which they're important, we should do that through the manager's office. We should do that through maybe another amendment in the future. But if you're dealing with the large housing complex, say over in the Highlands, the manager would meet with the owner, meet with the university, and come up with a plan to keep those cars off of those side streets, in my opinion. But you did use the term control. It would give us more control if we had this amendment.
Yes, it just makes it more easily enforceable because measurement along a traveled way is subject to a lot more vagaries of interpretation than measurement as the crow flies. Okay. We can do it by GIS, we can do it on a map. It's a simple line drawn, as opposed to making a determination as to which road you take, how you cross the streets, and that just makes it harder to enforce.
Okay, thank you. At this point, if it's okay with my colleagues, I'd like to open it up to the public to come and address any of your concerns or questions to the zoning subcommittee. And again, I really appreciate all of certainly most of the neighborhoods being here tonight, so thank you very much. John.
Thank you. John Hamblett, 495 Varnum Avenue, Pawtucketville Citizens Council. I am only addressing the micro business changes. And at this time, I'm going to be requesting that we withdraw these particular changes from tonight's City Council vote for further consideration. I think the intent, as Eric has outlined it, is excellent, to fill empty storefronts and to encourage small businesses, and I support that. I think that there will be some complications with the current wording. Let me just give you a few of my ideas. I would like to see a more definite definition of micro-business. For example, Commonwealth of Massachusetts defines a small business as 5 employees, and then there's a capitalization requirement, anything above $25,000 or $35,000. If we're talking about eliminating parking, it would seem to be that number of employees would be a critical metric to have in the zoning change. And the reason I say that is because whether you're looking at 2,000 square feet or 1,000 square feet, I have a problem trying to envision what that is. So I think of my barn, which is 40 by 45 feet or 1,800 feet. It just so happens I just walked off this room, and this room is about the same size as my barn, 45 by about 40 or 45 feet. It's just under 2,000 feet. So how many employees do you think you could fit in this space comfortably? And aren't they going to need parking? And if it was 1,000 square feet, how many employees could you fit in 1,000 and half this space, and where are they going to park? Now, if they're in the city, they can park in city garages, and they can park on the city street. If they were at 495 Varnum Avenue and I was zoned one of the 9 zones that is approved, either by right or by special permit, they couldn't park on Varnum Avenue and they couldn't park on West Meadow, so where are they going to park? It's a real challenge for us out in the neighborhoods. The second reason is I can see developers taking advantage of this. Wouldn't the Western Avenue Studios fall under this? Aren't those all under 1,000 square feet? And couldn't a developer come in and develop that entire parking lot with another 100 small artisan shops? And where would they park if that was zoned appropriately? I'm concerned both about the definition. I'm concerned that if it was built before January 1st of 2017, that it could be subdivided and used for multiple micro businesses that are still going to have employees with no place to park, particularly in a neighborhood where there isn't much parking available except in my driveway. So those were my main concerns.
Thank you, John.
Thank you.
Good evening, Merry Christmas,
Same to you.
everyone. I'm going to do my short version instead of my long version, but what I wanted to do is to support what John Hamlet said about taking it out completely, and a couple of reasons. First, I'd like to introduce Anne Marie Page from Centerville, John Gear from Belvedere, Nancy Judge from the Highlands, and the reason we're all here is because that ordinance affects all our neighborhoods. And what we wanted to bring up is, if you look at the zoning map and you look at the city of Lowell, you can't have a blanket ordinance. Now, if you look at each individual neighborhood has a TMU and a neighborhood business. But the way that the city is set up, each neighborhood is different for different criteria. So the neighborhood business in Belvedere or Centerville could be completely different on how that area is, as far as, does it abut single-family homes, does it abut other businesses? So that ordinance blankets the city, and you can't. You are a city of neighborhoods, 9 distinctive neighborhoods. And tonight I've heard a lot about downtown. Well, we're neighborhoods, and I think that that's why we want to be able to have you give us a Christmas present, take it out, and put it for further consideration. If it's an economic issue, well, that doesn't really affect a neighborhood. And so these neighborhood businesses, my short version is this. If you go to the left to the right, and you look at Pawtucketville, because I live there, I know this. There's a TMU, and there's also a neighborhood business. Now that TMU, the way that it's structured now, needs no parking. And we spent a good half year here over a project that was in a corner of a TMU that had parking, and they wanted to get a variance on less parking. And Nicholas Bonsanetto did a traffic study and said, well, guess what? You can't even park on the street over there. So that business with this new ordinance would be able to tomorrow go get their permits and put that project on there, even though it was denied by the city. Because right now, by you saying they don't need any parking, and the other thing that, and the size of the project would be 2,000 square feet. So that is just one area in Pawtucketville. In Centerville, they have no parking at all. So here you are, you have neighborhood business TMU right now. So if they have a business, they're required to have a space either every 500 square feet or every 900 square feet. And there's about 5 TMUs there. So what you're saying to Centerville is, well, there's 5 new businesses for you, and they're not required to have any parking. So you can go neighborhood to neighborhood to neighborhood to see why it doesn't work in any neighborhood for a neighborhood business or a TMU. And I just wanted to say, you know, Eric had mentioned earlier, like, why didn't this come up before? We asked the questions about the micro business, and we've worked with you for a year on this. The explanation we got on that clause about the ordinance, we're like, well, what does that mean about micro businesses? And we were told it's renaming an umbrella of businesses. We never understood that it really took away the parking requirement, and also the size of 2,000 square feet, as John pointed out in this room, and how many employees. And just sitting over there, whether I'm right or I'm wrong, and I'm reading it, there is, you talked about like if there was a brewery, or you could, you know, brew beer and sell beer. But on here, it talks about an establishment where, let's see, alcohol beverages are sold or consumed, which is not licensed to prepare or serve food. Well, currently, right now, in an NB and a TMU, they have to have 1 space, parking space per 100 square feet. Well, according to the new ordinance, that meant that in the old ordinance, they would have to have 20 spaces, and under this one, they don't have to have any. So if you could take it out, give it more consideration so that there could be more neighborhood input, and you could look at specifically what are the areas that they're concerned about for economic development and concentrate on those and find a remedy. I was here 2010 under Adam Backey, and they tried to change our neighborhood the criteria for neighborhood businesses, and actually Anne Marie and I at one time were opposed to each other because they wanted to change the neighborhood business to allow drive-throughs. Well, it never changed, and they still got the, was it the Jeanne d'Arc? What was the bank? The credit union. They were able to find a creative way.
DCU.
Yeah, okay. They were able to get that in there without changing the whole city ordinance. So there are cleverer ways to help economic development. So that's my short version. Thank you.
Thank you, Deb. Anyone else like to address the subcommittee? Again, thank you for being here. What's the wish of the subcommittee? I will certainly entertain a motion at this time from either one of my colleagues, again, supporting what the neighborhood has asked us to do, and also some of the changes that the administration's brought forward this evening. So.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, you make a good point, and so does the neighborhood groups that, you know, we are trying to fill vacant storefronts. So I think what everybody in this room knows what we're trying to accomplish. However, there's a difference from a downtown overlay district where you have a heavy pedestrian traffic, if you will, and several parking facilities. There's a big difference between that and Varnum Avenue or a neighborhood corridor that has no parking to begin with. And 2,000 square feet can be sizable. Now, in the downtown, most establishments, restaurants, if you will, with 2,000 square feet of floor space can have a capacity, if you will, of almost 150 people. legal capacity, that's approved fire code. That is just too much to bear for a residential neighborhood, as much as we are trying to fill vacant storefronts and help economic development in the city. So I think this needs to be sent back, Eric, for a little more consideration to these areas that we're trying to give a boost to, and yet not to cause an influx of parking unnecessarily to residential corridors. So I think the chairman makes a good point. So with that being said, I'd like to refer the recommendations from the neighborhood groups to the full city council. Mr. Chairman, is that what you're looking for?
Correct, to withdraw the language relative to micro businesses, Article 2
withdraw
under
the-
definitions, and then under the use of tables at 12.4, to actually take that out of the proposed zoning amendments that are currently before the council in a public hearing. So procedurally, I think we could recommend as a subcommittee to the full city council to do that at the public hearing. Procedurally, I believe? Yes. Yes, okay. So motion by Council Belanger, so we'll do this in a couple of parts, to remove the language relative to the micro businesses and the proposed table of use changes, to recommend to the full council at the public hearing that be withdrawn from consideration at this time. Motion by Council Belanger,
Second for discussion.
second for discussion by Councilor Rook. Councilor Rook.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So Eric, what type of businesses are retail or craft?
Yes, so the craft businesses would be small-scale manufacturing businesses that had a retail component of a minimum of 25%. So it would not be, so this would not include, for instance, restaurants, offices, any kind of, the idea would be it's not designed to include high employee businesses. A retail business of 2,000 square feet or less rarely has more than 1 or 2 employees in it. A craft business that had a minimum of 25% retail space might have slightly more employees in it, but again, these are the type of businesses that we are intending to encourage, and the districts, including the neighborhood business districts, to be honest, are the kind of places where we're encouraging these businesses to come. So the areas along Merrimack Street, Bridge Street, those corridors, they sometimes struggle to fill vacant spaces because of parking requirements. And the expectations of this ordinance would be in those districts, there's on-street parking that would be available to allow the businesses to go forward. The neighborhood's concern about the TMU was well taken, which is why we proposed to change it to a special permit, with the idea being that the availability or not availability of on-street parking to accommodate the parking demands of employees or customers would be taken into account by the planning board or the zoning board, as the case may be. But the businesses that would go in there would, again, are designed to not include high employee businesses, and the retail space would be on the small side, and so we wouldn't anticipate a high amount of employees on those businesses either.
Well, it wishes the subcommittee to send it back, that's fine. I think you run the risk of losing potential businesses coming in, especially with Eric's explanation of what is allowable and what's not. So, that's all I got.
Thank you. Anything else? Oh, John. We do have a motion on the floor, but yes, John.
I think Eric has articulated very well exactly why we want it sent back. He used number of employees as a criteria. So perhaps number of employees should be a criteria, and that's something that we would need to discuss in more than 7 minutes.
Okay, thank you. Could I have a roll call on the Council Belanger's motion, please?
Chairman Milonazo.
Yes.
Council Belanger.
Yes.
Council Rook.
Yes.
3 yeas.
The chair would entertain a motion to recommend to the full council the suggested changes brought forward by Development Services this evening. Chair would entertain, by Council Rourke, seconded by Council Belanger. Any discussion? Roll call?
Council Milonazo.
Yes.
Council Belanger.
Yes.
Council Rook.
Yes.
3 yeas.
Anything else to come before the zoning subcommittee? If not, the chair would entertain a motion to adjourn.
Sure, John.
So moved. Thank you. Thank you all for being here.